All right. Well, welcome back. Hope you all had a great Thanksgiving break. I'm just going to jump right into chapter 15 so we can finish it up and move on. I have set the due dates for everything that we've done so far, and I'll put up an announcement later on today just about kind of finishing up the class since this week and next week are our last regular weeks. But let's go ahead and get into chapter 15, which is all about pest management. And I think is one of the most important and difficult things really about um, growing crops, any kind of plant science. A lot of science goes into just the management of whatever it is that we consider a pest. And we take this integrated approach, this kind of whole system approach to it. So let's see if I can. All right. So as you all know, anybody that's grown a crop before, we almost always have some sort of pest issue. And we kind of say that anything that is a pest, I mean, it's in the kind of hand of the producer in a way. Um, you might not have the same perspective of what a pest is as another producer, but we quantify it in terms of plant science of how much money is lost due to a pest. And ideally, we want to avoid the loss of any money. We're going to have some loss of, revenue incurred just in the fact that we have to pay for prevention or control of the pests themselves. So whatever it is, crop to make it either a product that is not selling an actual crop itself, um, measures for pest control, whether that is prevention or control of the pest itself. Together, we look at those losses as being in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And that's kind of the pest prevention and control industry. What we lose to the pests plus what we spend on trying not to lose any of that to the pests. And as I mentioned, it is this integrated system. So we really need to have an understanding of what anything that could be a pest. So we think of other plants, aka weeds, and we think of the study of insects or entomology, as well as the very complex world of plant pathology, which we're looking at kind of the regular, pathways of production of the plant and getting everything correct. And also look at the study of the individual plant diseases. And a disease is just anything that negatively affects that plant. That is not categorized as another plant or an insect or so on and so forth. So we talk about IPM, and that's integrated pest management. And this is the kind of holistic approach, which I think of as, in a way, kind of a system of a bunch of different strategies depending on what it is that you're producing and what are kind of the key pests that you're going to face in that system. So when we look at IPM, we're not just using a pesticide. We might use a pesticide as part of it, but generally we're thinking of that whole system and thinking of why do we have the pests in the pest fix diagrams. I look at all these different parts, how they fit together as a program. So we'll look at kind of the different through the cultural practice to produce that crop and making all crop production parameters optimal, optimizing your crop production and using particular techniques are our cultural practices. We also look at genetics as part of that, but that is a whole kind of another ball game that's within the cultural practices. Ideally, we want a host that is resistant to any pests or disease. When we have pests or disease present, and I think of cultural mostly as kind of prevention, and prevention being sort of the foundation of integrated pest management. But if we actually have the presence of a pest to the point to where it's going to cause economic damage, we're going to lose money from the crop, it's going to reduce our yield or maybe even kill the crop, then we need to put into some sort of control into play. And that can be biological control using other living organisms, or it can be the use of chemicals. And we think of chemical application, people kind of separate like the organic stuff out of it, but really for our purposes in integrated pest management, we're going to consider those chemicals as well. Any pesticide, whether it's synthetic or not, we're kind of grouping in that method of management. We're applying something that is not a living thing to it. All right, so here are the 5 methods, kind of outline it. First, again, the cultural practices. So trying to really think about prevention here, preventing the pests in the first place, and making sure that we have all of those crop production parameters, your temperature, your growing season, your humidity, having those all dialed in to the optimal level for the best production of that plant. Because generally, a healthy plant is able to withstand some pest damage and kind of ward off pests on their own. Then we look at the physical or mechanical controls. And this is also can be prevention, but we're also getting into intervention as well. So part of that could just be pruning. Maybe you're removing dead and dying foliage from the plants. Some plants, if you're in crop production, you have to do that. We could also look at, say, you have insects on a crop, actually doing some hand removal. That is a physical or mechanical control, actually picking them off of the plant. Not easy to do on a large scale, but on a small scale, in a very highly valuable crop, it can make sense. We also think of traps as a physical or mechanical control, whether that's a sticky trap for insects, or maybe it's a large, live animal trap. And then we look at chemical applications, which is really any pesticide. And we separate pesticides into their individual categories. It's important to know that herbicides only control weeds. They only kill other plant species. And there are different classes of herbicides, those that are selective and kill only, say, monocots or dicots, or in some cases, herbicides that just kill a particular type of plant, whether it's woody or herbaceous. Then we look at insecticides, which kill insects. Important to note that there's a difference in the individual insecticides, what insects they actually kill, as well as recognizing that there are also other things that aren't insects, right? That we kind of might be a little crawling. We might consider them bugs, but like mites, for instance. So mites are in a totally different class of arthropods. Arthropods are anything that has an exoskeleton. A miticide will not kill an insect, and an insecticide will not kill a mite. So it's very important to identify and diagnose any problem that you have when we talk about insects, anything crawling, right, or flying. Antibiotics are those that really kill bacteria mostly. Fungicides, of course, kill fungi. Nematicides are a class of pesticides that kill microscopic worm-like creatures called nematodes. And those are generally microscopic and cannot be seen by the naked eye. They're usually living either on the soil or in the soil, or sometimes on the leaves of plants as well. And in all of these classes, if we think of, insects, there are good bugs and bad bugs, right? There are good mites and bad mites. There's good bacteria and bad bacteria, good fungi, bad fungi. All of these have kind of different classes within them, but any pesticide is pretty much going to kill everything that's in that group. So just recognize that within the particular pesticides, they kill somewhat specific classes or groups of these pests, but you have to know what the problem is to be able to use the proper pesticide. Biological control is kind of associated in some ways with chemical applications in a way, because you can apply them sometimes like as a spray. But what we think of for biological controls are using another living organism. And there's lots of ways to do that. We'll get into more detail here in just a bit. Another way that we look at managing plant pests is through regulatory measures. And these are usually through state or federal government. And we usually look at these as either quarantines or just a way to kind of prevent the introduction or the spread of pests and disease. So for instance, a government regulatory measure would be like, you cannot import, say, a specific seed from a specific country. We can't get wheat from Russia, for instance, because we could introduce a pest. That's just an example of that. Those have changed a lot over time. I don't really think about them so much in terms of IPM as something that we control, because it's another governing body that looks at it. So as a manager of crop production, you're also a pest manager. And it's a very complex system. So we have to look at all of these different tools in this strategy toolbox, basically, of IPM. And we're going to all do different things to meet the needs of our crops. And the way that we use these differently, I think, really is going to boil down to the dollar sign, really. I mean, how much money do we put into it? And that's what I want to focus on, is how, we're already kind of working on low margins with most crop production. So how do we avoid getting a lower margin? Generally, we do that by practicing intelligent IPM. So let's take a closer look at the cultural practices. Again, how we're actually producing that crop. So it's this balance, right? The balance of getting the right amount of light, water, and nutrients to maximize the plant growth. I think of the Goldilocks syndrome right here, right? So we want just the right amount. We don't want too much. We don't want too little of all of these inputs that we're putting in to grow our crop. So we think of those as being our cultural practices, but we think of our cultural control as altering those practices as a way to avoid a pest. So one of the things that we use a lot is this kind of triangle of really practices, pretty much, and how we might alter that to change a part of the triangle. For a triangle to stand, we have to have all three parts. So in this case, we're looking at the disease triangle, but it's the same for any kind of pest. We have to have first a host, something for the pest or pathogen to feed on. And generally, if we have a strong, healthy host, then the pest can't actually infect it. So that's why this is kind of the base of the triangle here. We also have to have the presence of whatever it is that's causing the problem with the plant, insect, or in the case of pathogens, when we talk about diseases, you have to have kind of the spores floating around. We have to have the presence of the organism itself. And then finally, we also have to have the correct environment for that pest or pathogen to be able not only just to survive and do damage, but usually to actually breed and get to the level to where they are actually incurring some economic damage. So our cultural practices are going to alter it in a way either that we avoid ever having the presence of the pest, and a lot of times we'll do that through like physical barriers, like a crop row cover, for instance, or having like sticky mats outside of a crop production area. The environment, we can change the humidity level, or we can change the based on our practices, to maybe exclude a pest. Maybe it's you're treating it And usually with the environment and controlled um, environment agriculture in places like greenhouses or in modern production, even indoor growing. If we can control the environment, then we can often control the significance of a pest infestation. So those are the different ways that we can use cultural practices to alter this kind of pest triangle. If we don't have one of those, then we don't have the pest's ability to do damage. All right, so looking at some of the, I guess, ideas of cultural practices in the field, think of tillage itself. We can use tillage or cultivation to control emerge weeds or bury seedlings that are just germinating. We can use drainage or irrigation as a way to modify the environment and how much water might be there. We want just enough for the plant, but not too much to where um, it's affecting the ability for the crop to uptake nutrients or to even uptake water in some cases. Also, if you have standing water, that is usually a place where pests and diseases are able to really breed and multiply. The nutrient issue, so over or under fertilization makes a host more susceptible to pathogen and insect attack. If they got too much, is just as bad as not enough. So you really have to think about nutrients and fertility as getting that Goldilocks amount. We might look at a cultural control. One great example, I think kind of the classic example is just crop rotation. It's simple, but it's very effective. So if you're growing corn one place one year and you had, say, southern blight, for instance, if you move your corn to a different field next year where that southern blight wasn't there, then you have less of that pathogen present in terms of the spores that might be floating around or might be living on that crop residue. So you can just grow them back and not have to contend with it from the beginning. So crop rotation is a very simple cultural practice. It can be used as a control. One of the big things, again, I think the basis of IPM is prevention. So the removal or destruction of anything that is infected or infested, whether that's a plant or whether it's in the soil, or if you're in a greenhouse, maybe in the media. Actually using genetically resistant varieties or pathogen-free seed, and also just cleaning anything that you would use. So cleaning your implements on your tractor, cleaning any hand tools that you might use, sterilization. That goes a long way into prevention of the pest in the first place. On the genetics, we think of that genetic kind of code, the DNA of the plants. If we select particular varieties that, say, if you're growing tomatoes, for instance, we grow a blight resistant variety if we know that blight is an issue in our area, then that can avoid or minimize plant losses caused by pests and or pathogens. So, that's a very simple way to look at it. Just trying to find a variety that is resistant to whatever it is that seems to be plaguing you. So there are a lot of different cultivated varieties that are being developed through traditional breeding systems and just selection to develop this genetic host resistance. But we're also starting to do some genetic modification engineering to maintain yields, even if we have loss due to disease or insect pest pressure. And one of those that's become pretty popular is the use of BT varieties of corn, for instance, where that corn is actually producing this bacteria actually in the plant itself. So if an insect comes along and feeds on it, then it dies. It's not able to breed. course, I think probably we think mostly of pest management as I, you know, applying some sort of pesticide. And there's many different ways to do that. Um, I think chemical application is a very important tool in that box, but we generally think of using chemical applications as a last resort, and that's mostly because it costs a lot of money. So if we can prevent it um, in the first place, or if we can use other methods of control before we get to chemical application, then we might not have to spend that much money. However, we generally set thresholds for our crops. If we have X number of pests, then that you're going to lose so much money from the yield reduction of that crop that warrants you to spend the extra dollar on that pesticide to prevent that loss. So if everything, lines up, then, definitely, use the pesticide. It definitely is sometimes warranted, but we think about using it more as a last resort. And some reasons for that are not just because of the increased production costs, although I think that's probably the biggest reason. But I mean, also there are some unintended consequences of using pesticides. Doesn't matter if it's certified organic or not. They can still be dangerous to other people. The pesticide applicator itself. There's a reason why we have to suit up and wear the personal protective equipment, is to avoid the danger of inhaling pesticides. It can also do some damage to the crop environment itself. Again, we think of it as an ecosystem, an agricultural ecosystem, and everything that's in that ecosystem plays a role. We don't always want to just kill everything. Usually we want to try to maximize the beneficial organisms and just get rid of the bad ones. So other than that, of course, um, I think one of the big issues is that a lot of pesticide application, especially outdoors, if you're spraying it on a windy day, then there's a lot of drift happening. So it's moving on to other operations. Back when we were farming full time, we had issues with that from the next door Chestnut Foundation farm. They used some heavy duty chemicals, and here we are, transitioning to organic. If that pesticide drifts over onto the farm, then that endangers our ability to, be certified. So there could be a loss of money there as well. So again, I mean, there's lots of issues surrounding pesticides. I think it's important to know the pesticide itself. And I'm just going to say that none of them are necessarily good or bad. It's just how we what our perspective of it is. If we need to use it to keep our crop from dying, then by all means. But just be aware of all the unintended consequences of pesticide use as well. For biological control, we're using often what we call beneficial insects or beneficial bacteria or fungi or even nematodes. And usually these are kind of the predators. We think of the good guys as those that are eating the bad guys, or just negatively affecting the bad guys. There's all kinds of different biological controls out there, and they generally are an environmental friendly alternative to the use of pesticides, but they can also have unintended consequences too. So we usually look at them as either killing or suppressing whatever it is that is a pest, either through parasitizing the pest or pathogen itself. So for instance, we might say release parasitic wasps in a greenhouse. And these wasps will lay their eggs into like an aphid, for instance. And basically, when they hatch, they'll kill it by eating it from the inside out. Sometimes we also use these biocontrol organisms that just compete with the pest or pathogen for space or nutrients. If the good guys can outcompete the bad guys, kind of occupy that niche in the ecosystem, then they can prevent a lot of damage. Sometimes they're also able to produce toxins that will kill or make the target pest um, less able to do damage. Or in some cases, we can also use them to change the way that the host is able to withstand a pest or pathogen attack, make it less susceptible. All right, so again, on the government regulatory measures, one of the main things that they do is the use of quarantines, just to prevent incoming material, plant material that has potential pests being carried on it. And if we look at history, a lot of our major pest problems that have kind of decimated species, like the American chestnut, for instance, we imported the chestnut blight on Asian stock. So if there was, at the time, of course, this was the early 1900s, so we didn't have a great understanding of, you know, all the biological issues associated with moving things around the planet. So if we had had that understanding and prevented or at least quarantined the plants that came in until we can actually tell whether they're going to do damage or not, then we could have prevented this entire really forest change that happened here. American chestnut was 2/3 of the canopy of the eastern U.S. forests, and now they're completely gone. So it can work, but that's not something that we do as pest managers. It's something that the government does. So again, any kind of pest is really based on your perspective as a producer. So I think one of the things that illustrates that best is weeds. So a weed is any plant that is competing with your desired plant, your crop, for those optimal crop production parameters: the water, the nutrients, the sunlight. Um, Weeds can also interfere with harvesting or just reduce a crop's quality. They can also harbor pests and pathogens, and also compete with crop for pollinating insects. So anything that does that is generally we consider a weed. When we talk about controlling weeds, it's important to understand the plant's life cycle. So annual weeds, are going to come up every year. So they rely on seed germination. The biennials, there are some weeds that are major biennials, but the big thing I think with them is that we want to control them in the first year while they're still vegetatively productive. Once they start to flower and go to seed, often they've got such a effective root system that it's more difficult to remove them. Perennial weeds are kind of the worst, I think, because really we need to control them before we ever plant anything in the first place. So by understanding the life cycle of the weeds, we can kind of have more informed and better control of weed management. We consider invasive weed species anything that is particularly aggressive, regardless of the life cycle of the plant. Usually we think of these as non-native to the ecosystem under consideration. So it's important to think about that in terms of the invasive weed species. You could have a native plant that, say, is just from a different ecosystem, or maybe even a different county, right? It's native here, it's not native here. It's invasive when it moves here and is able to outcompete with our crops. And invasive weeds have really caused a lot of issues on the economic front. But there are some that can even be harmful to human health, and that's mostly due to harboring different insects and disease that can be parasites of us. For instance, there's the Amur honeysuckle, for instance, is an Asian variety of honeysuckle that can harbor deer ticks, which spread Lyme's disease. So in a way, invasive weeds are bad for our crops, but they can be bad for people too. So generally, weeds are competitive. If you have any unintended plant growing and near your crops, then they can do damage to it just by competing with it for water and for nutrients. So you can see here in this image, the corn on the left that has had those weeds removed grows much taller and has a higher yield than the corn on the right, where they haven't done anything to control the weeds. The annual weeds often rely on just producing a ton of seeds. So just taking a look at this table here that comes out of the book, one of the really bad ones here, the pigweed, Amaranthus retroflexus here, look at that, produced 230,000 seeds per plant. And then those seeds remain viable in the soil for, in some cases, decades, 40 or 50 years in some cases. So whenever we have annual weed problems, the best thing to do is to prevent them from going to seed again. So don't let it go to seed if you can prevent it. Another issue with lots of weeds is their ability to reproduce vegetatively, not just through seeds. So these are all examples of plants that have some sort of vegetative reproduction. Like Johnson grass on the left there has this long underground rhizome that allows new clumps to appear. If it gets separated from that rhizome, it'll grow a new clump. We've also got nut sedge there in the center, where it has these little tubers that are kind of holding on to that plant. And if you pull it out by hand, then those tubers often remain, and then they just grow right back. So it can be a difficult weed to get rid of through this vegetative production. So that's another issue with controlling weeds, and really for the perennial cases, why we want to try to remove anything, including what is growing underground. On the genetics for weeds, one of the big issues for them is that they can basically change their phenotype based on what environment they have. So this is called phenotypic plasticity, where pretty much if it's got enough water, then it's going to be able to grow larger and compete more with your crop plants than if it were growing in its regular kind of maybe a dry soil. So how do we control weeds? For cultural control, we look at often doing some sort of cultivation. We can sometimes even just alter when we plant our crops. So if we move our crop planting back a little bit and allow for weeds to pop up between our soil cultivation, between disking and harrowing, say, then that next stage of cultivation will remove a lot of those weeds. So a lot of the annual weeds do emerge early, and just by moving our crop planting date back a little bit, we might not lose yield, but be able to control the weeds a little bit easier. We can also modify the spacing of our crops. If we can also think about planting our crops earlier. So say your cold hardy crops, for instance, if you plant them earlier in the season before the summer annual weeds have popped up, then they're not able to really grow and compete with the plant as much because they're not getting enough light. And the root systems of your host plant are already large enough to where they can have vigorous growth. So by modifying the crop row spacing, we can get more of a canopy to where those weeds can't get in and grow like crazy. Crop rotation can also be effective in weed control because the way that we change our cultural practices for a different crop can often affect the way that especially annual weeds germinate. Flooding is another weed control practice if your crop can withstand it. So that's often used with rice production. Cover crops are a great way to suppress the germination of weed seeds, but also as a way to kind of clean any existing weed species that are in there, because usually our cover crops are pretty vigorous, and we're going to be killing and using that cover crop residue often as a mulch, that will also suppress weeds from coming up. There's also, you're probably somewhat familiar with this in terms of if you ever had a garden, they say don't plant, um, your tomatoes or some particular plants near walnut trees. And it's through this phenomenon known as alleopathy. And alleopathy is basically just the way that some plants will leach chemicals out of their root systems, and that can negatively affect other plants. So we could use this in a beneficial way for particular plants, especially some of our cover crops. Some of the brassicas will do this kind of biofumigation through alleopathy, and will have a suppressive effect on any weeds that might be there. Of course, we also think of the mechanical weed control of post weed emergence. After we planted our crop, weeds emerge. One of the main things that we do to control them is either hand pulling them or hoeing or through tillage. So there's all kinds of different rotary hoes or cultivators, discs, and harrows that are available to perform weed control in crop fields. Of course, there are some concerns along with that, with mostly with soil erosion and soil compaction. So a lot of people have kind of moved to no-till from that. Mowing is often used in between rows to prevent weeds from going to seed, but also if you're mowing often enough, it will cause the weeds to deplete their own carbohydrates in the plant, and can also sometimes kill the vegetative propagules of weedy plants too. Mulching is one of the most common methods of weed suppression that we use more in the horticulture world, in growing, say, ornamental flowers, or even in vegetable crops, and also in many cases in nurseries too. So just using anything to smother weeds and hold in moisture. We kind of look at mulches as the organic mulches, and by organic, I'm not saying like certified organic. I'm just talking about they break down, and then as they break down, they're releasing nutrients. I prefer the organic mulches myself. One downside of that is that they can break down and then serve as a seed bed for new weeds to emerge. So you have to kind of continually mulch throughout the season if you're using an organic mulch, but it does break down and contribute to the organic matter of the soil. So double-edged sword there. Plastic mulches and fabric mulches have been used more and more often, especially in vegetable production, because it doesn't just suppress some of the aggressive weeds, whether it's an annual or a perennial, but it also creates a more favorable microclimate for the plants, depending on the color of the mulch. So sometimes we use like the white plastic to cool down that environment, reflect the sunlight away from the mulch area, or we might use black plastic as a way to absorb heat and make a warmer microclimate. Fire is also a classic weed control strategy. Slash and burn agriculture is that's part of the basis of it. I actually like to use fire. In some cases, don't want to sound like a pyromaniac out here, but sometimes we'll get the torch out and burn weeds, especially grasses that have gone to seed. So if you burn the seeds themselves, then they can't become a bad problem next year. So controlled burning, whether it's used in agriculture or just in rangeland management, prairie management, lots of different applications for fire as a method of weed control. And there are these specialized flame weeders that basically you just connect to a propane tank and go through and actually burn weeds. Sometimes you can do that, especially like in carrot production, something that's slow germinating. Go ahead and cultivate it, plant your carrot seed. It's going to take often 2 weeks for that seed to come up. So you let it go for a week, and then to burn any weeds that have come up in that time. And these specialized flame weeders are hot enough to where they kill the above ground growth, but they're not going to be able to kill the germinating seeds. Biological weed control is not something that we often practice in agriculture anyway. They do use it kind of more in kind of ecosystem control and management, but that would be, introducing something like, say, an insect that eats just the weed. So you have to be very careful with that. We do use it, of course, in livestock production, rotating different animals around so that they're feeding at different heights. The goat is probably the classic biological weed control in livestock production. So you bring it in, and if you tether it to a specific place, it will eat anything that's in there. Sometimes they'll even eat things like multiflora rose, thorny plants. So this is not usually the best for in terms of plant production, but biological weed control is an option. When it comes to chemical weed control, there are a few different things that, I guess, ways. Think of the pathway and how it's affecting the plant. We use herbicides for the purpose of controlling weeds. The characteristics we really want to look at and examine closely in using herbicides for weed control are, first, it's selectivity. So is it selective enough to be able to spray it on a crop? It doesn't kill the crop, it just kills the weeds. Consider that, especially if you have genetically engineered Roundup ready crops. We also want to look at the timing of the application. Some herbicides are not as effective later on in stages of plant growth or earlier on. Of course, how much we use and the way that the herbicide actually affects the plant itself. So for selectivity, there are some kind of more selective herbicides, and they're inventing more, but most general class is either it kills grasses or it kills broadleaf plants, monocots or dicots, or the non-selective, which kills both. So that can be a way to use selectivity for particular control. We can also look at them according to timing. We use burn down herbicides as a way to basically remove existing weeds from fields, to prepare a clean seed bed for planting. We use pre-plant herbicides and apply those before the crop is planted, which usually you're incorporating those into the soil, or pre-emergent herbicides that can be applied either after or before, in terms of planting of whether you're doing transplanting or by seed. So if you're transplanting, you can use that after crop planting or before crop planting, because you've already got the root system going. Pre-emergents are going to prevent the germination of anything that's in the soil. So you want to use that usually kind of at the right time. So pre-emergents often do require some moisture for maximum efficacy as well. So keep that in mind. Post-emergent herbicides are those that are applied directly to the foliage of the plant after weed emergence, but you have to be careful not to get that on your crop, of course, because it will kill it unless it is a selective herbicide. We can also use different equipment for applying herbicides. Very important here to be careful about cleaning that equipment thoroughly if you're going to use it for multiple purposes. So you don't want to be spraying, say, a foliar feed onto a plant and something that you've also used an herbicide, because that residue can be very damaging too. Here's just a look at the different general modes of action that herbicides play on the plant itself. And so generally, what all these are really doing is just interrupting the plant's production and through different chemicals, basically. Whether it's preventing them from creating new proteins or preventing them from being able to photosynthesize. They're basically just disrupting some part of the plant's life cycle so that it can no longer grow. Most of these will cause the plant to starve itself. So the modes of action work differently on different plants. So that's the most important thing to note there. When we get into kind of the creepy crawly things, the insects and mites, we have to look at, again, how are we producing the plant? So kind of back to step one, think about designing your crop production system with in mind that everything should be at the optimal level for the production of that particular variety of plant, not just the species, but different varieties use nutrients differently. But also, how are you planting the whole field? So when we think of a lot of pest problems, they tend to be more problematic in the monocultures where we're planting a large area of just one plant. So that's how we do a lot of field crops. We plant huge acreages of corn, and by doing so, we're kind of creating a buffet for the crawling or flying insects and mites, so that they can just come in and eat as much as they have, which allows them to breed, lay eggs, and kind of continue their life cycle. Another big issue with these moving pests, the insects and mites, is that they are able to have many more generations than our crop species. Our crops are planted, and we might only get one cycle each year, each growing season in the field. But these insects and other pests are able to go through several life cycles, many generations, which gives them also a greater ability to adapt. So in general, we want to try to avoid huge monocultures where we can. Not always avoidable, though, especially when we think about the economics of it. And I'm going to go ahead and stop there. And I'll just ask if you guys have any questions or concerns before we sign off for the day. All right, y'all. Well, I'll let you guys go. Do want to let you guys know that I actually have to be in a interview on Wednesday. So I'm on a hiring committee, and that was the only day that they could do the interviews. So I'll have to just pre-record the rest of this conversation on integrated pest management for you guys and post that.
If I send you that Google Drive folder link, you can put it in there, and I just stick it in YouTube playlist with everything else.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess you guys can probably come in a little later on Wednesday. I'll add that to an announcement, and I'll send you the email a little later on just to remind you to share that link with me, Tom.
Okay. I'll hopefully do that this afternoon.
All right. Thank you guys. Have a great day.
Okay. Have fun.